Our next speaker is Otto Langer. Otto is a fisheries and biologist, aquatic ecologist. He worked for the DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, for 32 years in habitat protection. He's a qualified expert who's given expert witness in well over 100 actions against pollution and habitat destruction in courts in Canada, from the Arctic to Newfoundland to Vancouver Island. The primary work is in BC, Yukon, and the Fraser River and the estuary. He's published many papers, been involved in habitat management programs, and after leaving government, he joined the David Suzuki Foundation, created the Marine Conservation Program, and in his so-called alleged retirement, and he volunteers for a host of organizations. This man is always busy, and he brings his extensive expertise and knowledge. He's a recipient of many prestigious awards. Please join me in welcoming Otto Langer to speak on science, politics, and the industrial agenda.
Well, it's great to be up here. I've had a few of my battles in the government, spending months of my life fighting to save Angus Creek, so I finally got back to it this morning to have a look at it, and there was chum salmon spawning in it. About 30 years ago, it was totally destroyed by Jackson logging. We spent weeks in court battling for that stream, and that's just a lesson that Chief Craigan mentioned, that you got to look at a long term, and come 30 years later, I look at the stream, it still hasn't recovered, and that was just from a slide on a logging road up the valley. So there's quite a time element to everything we talk about, and when we think into the future, we've got to ensure that the companies and the consultants think well into the future. If we can't think 100 years in the future, we're in real trouble. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit of everything, I suppose, in my presentation. Here, I'll have to look at what I'm talking about. Whoops, the mouse isn't working. Does this machine work? No. How did you make it work?
I just had websites up.
This is really odd. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we got it working finally. There. Okay, I want to talk about the spatial time relationship in terms of where we've been in the last 150 years, and I call it post-European contact. And really, the Europeans started off in British Columbia probably in a big-time way with the Caribou Gold Rush in 1859 or so. And over the last 150 years, a lot has changed in British Columbia, as you're all well aware of, and we can't blame it all on the Europeans. There's been many more groups of people that have lived in this land and have an impact on it. The anthropogenic impacts in our landscape has actually been quite phenomenal. And so we go from the first placer miners to, I just threw up a modern slide. This is what the vapor group is on. I won't have another picture of a schematic of jet fuel tankers now approved to come into the Fraser River, a large tank farm. And this tank farm is actually on Port Metro Vancouver lands, and they're benefiting it from renting it to the Vancouver Airport Fuel Consortium, and yet the Port Metro Vancouver have been entrusted by the federal government now to do environmental impact reviews in 17 harbors across Canada. All the harbors do their own environmental reviews. So you do a review of a project that's going to impact the estuary, you're going to make money from it, and then you approve it. And this is the governments we now have in place. Can you have a greater conflict of interest than the developer calling the hearings, doing the environmental assessments, and then approving the projects? And that's why we've got a real problem. So Metro, in our Metro Vancouver area, Port Metro Vancouver is probably the greatest threat we have now to the Fraser Estuary and that part of the Salish Sea, and the impacts carry well beyond their jurisdiction, right up to Texada Island and coal issues. No, it's still not working, darn it. Maybe if we turned it on, it would work. There. And over those last 150 years, and this is usually a presentation in itself of what we've all been through. Oops, sorry about that. We've had a tremendous amount of impact. if I had more time, I'd go through the 3 industrial ages we've been through. And the first one, of course, was after the gold rush rated to World War I. Then we had quite a rest. The environment had a rest from, we lost 67,000 young workers, and they're key to the economy. So the Canadian economy really slowed down. We had the Spanish flu, and the fish and the wildlife and our marshes and the ocean had quite a rest for a number of years until World War II came along. Then we ran into the second industrial revolution, and that really changed the British Columbia landscape with the highways, the ports, more railways, pipelines, Fraser River alone, 7 new pulp mills in the Fraser River. So you can imagine some of those impacts on the landscape. And that development carried on through the 1970s era, right on to about the year 2000, and I call that the era of enlightenment. We did have significant and great economic growth in Canada, but at that time, we also became very aware of what we were doing to the environment. We learned from our history, and darn it, we started putting laws in place. Some of us as young biologists pushed for, we had to protect habitat in the Fisheries Act. Within a couple of years, we got habitat protection in the Fisheries Act, thanks to Pierre Trudeau, of all people. And later on, we got SIA, we got SARA, and we were almost smiling by the 1980s. We got a no-net-loss policy in the Fisheries Act. We hadn't reached a point of no-net loss. We'd reached a point of slow net loss, but that was a great improvement over rapid net loss of habitat. And then things seemed to fall out. The bottom fell out of the building, and the roof collapsed on us. Whoops. What's going on here? And I won't comment a lot about the picture I have in the top, but I think that's really where our problems began. And we ran into this jobs growth and prosperity agenda. And about the same time, and I'm certain that it's been a conspiracy to some large degree. These things just didn't all happen at once after when the recession was over, and suddenly Port Metro Vancouver gets their most aggressive developer that we've ever had from England via Australia. Sylvester is his name, and Robin Sylvester. And he's hell-bent on basically industrializing Delta, paving over all the farmland, and in a sense get rid of the tunnel, get a big $8 billion bridge or so in place over the Fraser River, and dredge out the river and create it into a Rotterdam. And that's the plan, and that's where we're at right now. And I'm certain Harper's saying this is exactly what the gateway projects are all about. And out of that, we have spinning off Surrey, Texada coal projects, we have LNG, we have Site C, we have pipelines, we have tankers. Industry's got everything, really. It's been the perfect storm. We get rid of key environmental laws, we get rid of our habitat laws, we neutered the Navajo Waters Protection Act, we protected 1 million lakes and waterways in Canada, we went down to about probably 200 or 300. We neutered the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Habitat protection staff losses in DFO, they lost 50% of their staff, we've lost most of our scientists, and above all, we've lost our will to protect, and that'll even come up in a later slide or two. The cumulative impacts over those years, well, we've had a little bit of everything. You've all traveled around, you've seen the landscape, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. But from our past, we've gained a great environmental awareness. We've gained a greater will to protect. That's not reflected in government. And we have had some laws and policies put in place, but we're losing the battle in keeping them in place. We've got to restore them now. Whoops, I'm having a problem here today. Okay, issues in our Gulf of Georgia, Salish Sea area. Some of the bigger projects, and I consider in the Fraser River, these are some of the nails in the coffin of the Fraser River, is the Vancouver Airport Fuel Facilities Corporation jet fuel proposal in the Fraser River. In 1988, the same consortium of the 28 big airlines at Vancouver Airport wanted to barge fuel from Washington State into the Fraser River because it could save a few cents a litre and avoid provincial sales tax. And if you bring in fuel from the U.S., you don't have to pay U.S. fuel fuel charges. So this was a way to avoid Canadian refineries and get cheap U.S. fuel to Canada. But the federal government properly, and this is 1988, the federal government before SEA said we've got to have an environmental review. It was the old Federal Environmental Assessment and Review Office. And they set up a panel of 3 distinguished people, held days of hearings, and they said, no, we can't have this in the Fraser Estuary. It's too great a threat to the fish and wildlife resources and to people. So it was rejected. And I think that's 25 years ago. Nowadays, we have a proposal 10 times larger to bring in 80,000-ton tankers from China, India, Singapore, so they can avoid American fuel and get cheaper fuel from the Far East, $1.50 saving. And that was approved by our provincial government. The federal government wasn't even there to do a review because they've delegated to Port Metro Vancouver, and Port Metro Vancouver got together with the BC Environmental Assessment Office and said, yeah, this is great, there's no problem at all, and we get an approval in place. So you can see where we've gone in the last 25 years. Why did we protect the environment much better in the 1980s than we do in 2013, 2014? There's something really sick in this land. Some of the impacts of all the coal barges, the tankers, and we're talking about hundreds, thousands more tankers and barges than that in the Strait of Georgia. Tremendous noise problems, problems for our whales. There are going to be spills and kills. It's not if, it's when they occur. And the airport people say, well, we'll only have a 50-gallon spill every 6 years in the Fraser River, a 50-barrel spill. That's a lot of liters of toxic, explosive, flammable kerosene in the river. And their solution was to take fire hoses and just flush it out in the river and let it evaporate. That was their solution in their environmental impact review. And we raised hell. And then they said, well, in every 30 years, we'll only have a 1,000-barrel spill in the river. And the province has accepted this as totally acceptable for the Fraser River. If you have a 50-barrel spill in the Fraser River at the time of a sockeye salmon run, you've got to shut down the whole fishery. It'll contaminate the gear. It may not kill the adult salmon, but it'll contaminate them. No one will be able to eat them. Can you imagine the impact to the Aboriginal fishery, the food fishery, the commercial fishermen, the sports fishermen when you shut down a big fishery? And basically the province ignored all of that. And through all of this, where was Federal Environment Canada? Where was DFO? In 1985, I took one of the federal leads in DFO to fight the jet fuel proposal, and we got it rejected. Nowadays, they don't even appear. And during 1,000 days of this environmental review, there wasn't 1 minute of public hearings. And this is the BC environmental assessment process, so we've now taken them to court, and the group is called Vapor in Richmond. And I think that's almost our last resort, and you see more and more of that happening, and that's quite unfortunate. It's a costly thing to do, but the government's not listening, and it's totally jobs, economic growth, and growth at any cost. And I guess in my wildest nightmares, I didn't think we'd reach this point, probably in the 1980s, when I thought things could only get better, they couldn't get worse. Well, they've gotten a lot worse. We're back into the 1960s again right now. And just one point I'll make out here, and you saw in earlier pictures the Roberts Bank. It was always called the Roberts Bank Superport. And the coal pile is the original port, West Shore Terminals, and then behind it to the upper right-hand side, that was developed as the container port. And now they say this just isn't adequate anymore. And the big new pod that they want to put to the left-hand side, that's Roberts Bank Terminal 2 that we're also fighting. And you can imagine this being stuck in the Strait of Georgia, how that affects the ocean currents, how this affects salmon movements. It's quite an insult to the environment, and this is another battle. We not only have jet fuel, we have coal here, we have Neptune terminals. Now we're going to have another superport, which is a massive insult to Roberts Banks. It never seems to end, and some of these projects are going to give rise to massive habitat impacts. There's no doubt about it. When we look at the existing Roberts Bank port, the coal facility there, and I was involved in it, and I saw the pile of sand being built there before there was coal on it when I first joined government in 1969. And within a matter of months, there were complaints from fishermen and from people living on Tsawwassen Heights. There were even claims people painted their house with enamel, which dried rather slowly, and there was a windstorm, and their house would turn gray with the coal dust stuck on it. And then the National Harbor Board would have to pay them to repaint their house again. But coal dust does move around. That was pretty obvious with this first coal port that we had in that part of the world. We have light problems. People are always complaining about the lights. The noise is phenomenal at that port. I've camped down at the tip of Point Roberts, 4 kilometers away. In the middle of the night, you can just hear the coal port going 24 hours a day. I'd hate to live in that part of the world, but you can imagine that impact on wildlife and the fisheries. And as I mentioned in the photograph, tremendous blockage to the marine currents, sediment movements, and the fish movements in that area. The Surrey Texada dock proposal, thank God, I'd like to think it has been approved, but as far as Port Metro Vancouver and that environmental assessment fiasco is involved, it's an okay. Of course, we're going to have noise, we're going to have lights, we're going to have dust, we're going to have spills. You do have coal spills. We had quite a large one at Roberts Bank a few years ago when ships went through that giant gantry structure you saw in an earlier picture. And it's a phenomenal increase in river and ocean traffic. And if you don't think there's a dust problem, just look at this picture I took last fall. This is a Surrey Fraser dock where they'd bring the American thermal coal, and the facility will be built here. And soybean is a pretty clean commodity. In fact, it's clean enough that we eat the darn stuff. And here they're loading it, and they can't control the dust from a food product. And Metro Vancouver has taken action against them. Well, they've gone to court now saying, gee, we're exempt from local controls. We're on federal land. And if you can't load soybeans without creating a massive problem that people in surrounding hillsides can't put up with, can you imagine what coal will do? And that's just an industrial commodity. We're probably going to handle it a bit more carelessly than a food product. Now let's get a little bit more scientific. Coal dust impacts from the air and runoff. And runoff is a big problem. Probably you're going to maybe lose more tons from the runoff of a coal port than you will from the windstorms. It's just that it depends who you are, whether you're a human a kilometer away or you're a crab living around the dock area. In the past, in the Kootenays, Alberta, Vancouver Island, coast discharges and dumping of coal waste in the ocean was just largely ignored. It wasn't considered a problem at all. And if you go to Catamount in the Eastern Rockies in Alberta, you still see the coal running off from the old mines right into the river. In McLeod River, no one's doing anything about it. The first real concern was when some of us young biologists were hired and the Roberts Bank port started loading up coal there, and we started getting complaints. And our first report was published in 1977. I won't say anything more about it other than I'll show a few slides from that work. Then in about 1980, I was called as a witness for the Attorney General of BC to help prosecute Bryven Creek collieries who polluted Michelle Creek in the Kootenays with coal dust, where the proved coal dust was deleterious. I was called as an expert witness at Bull Moose Mines and Tumbler Ridge in about 1998, and we were able to prove once again coal dust or coal in water was a deleterious substance. Last year we had a tulamine and obed spill into the Athabasca River. Nothing seems to be happening in terms of enforcement action. The government has folded their books and gone home. And bringing it back to here, and since Donald Gordon is here, thank God I gave him credit for these photographs. This is the coal facility we have here. And when I look at a photograph, even something taken from space, I would say, yes, we've got a coal dust problem. Not all the coal is staying in the port. It's drifting off into the right side of that photograph. I think the provincial government, or Donald can correct me, said, no, that's just wood waste. It's not coal dust at all. But it's not that you will have a coal dust problem and a coal pollution contamination problem. You've got it already, and this is a small facility. I won't say anything more. I don't want to steal his fire. A couple more pictures from him, and I won't comment on the pictures, but many more recent studies have been done on coal dust and much more better impact information available. There is no doubt it's a deleterious substance. Despite that, EcoJustice went to Ottawa several months ago and said, we've had a coal dust spill into Burnaby Creek. What are you going to do? And a lawyer in Ottawa for the Minister of Fisheries wrote back, as coal is generally not considered deleterious, no immediate violation of the Fisheries Act was observed. So you can see Harper has gotten right down into the scientists and to the lawyers to prove that coal dust is not a deleterious substance, but probably nothing else is a deleterious substance, and hardly anything can harm habitat anymore, because that's not even in the Fisheries Act anymore. So you can see how Harper's really affected environmental protection in Canada. Okay, you're looking at some data from the work we did in the early 1970s. You can see the gill space in a crab gill, which is a lung of the crab. And the gill lamellae is a tissue that you'd find in the gill of a rainbow trout, similar to our lung. And this is crabs that have lived on clean sand for 22 days. And we did much more work than presented here, but a 12% coal dust, which you can find around the docks and that. You can see these sharp little particles of black starting to accumulate in the gills. And at 50% coal dust, and you can find that around dock areas because the surface sediments can almost be 100% coal dust, you can see tremendous clogging of the gills. Running out of time, so I won't comment too much more on that. Dust impacts, there is going to be habitat contamination. You're going to have excessive traffic. It's going to affect their gills. It's going to affect their burrowing behavior. The more coal dust you have, the crabs disappear in the sediments. They don't crawl on the surface of sediments, and it'll affect the fish gills. However, it's a cumulative impact of jet fuel, coal dust, Roberts Bank 2, more traffic, and must be addressed. Then we look at the consultant study, and each one of them say, well, our project is going to be an insignificant impact, forget about it, and we're missing the boat in the environmental assessment game. Why all of this now? Well, I've sort of covered it earlier on. I think it's really the jobs, economic growth, out of control, Port Metro Vancouver, ineffective environmental assessments, and this is a perfect storm, and it depends whether you enjoy storms or not. We're not enjoying the storm, but industry is going to benefit greatly from it. Have we forgotten our natural heritage? It's still a relatively healthy waterway, but it's endangered, and I think we have to really stand up and be noticed. What can we do? We have to be more strategic, political, and legal in our approach. We have to focus on the green vote and get out the young vote. We have to protect and restore what we had prior to the year 2000. NGOs and fishing game groups have to get together. They don't get together at all right now. We have to cultivate greater public concern and turn that concern into action. We have to be more assertive than we often are on most of these issues, get into court. And most losses are forever. It'll take 100 years to recover a lot of losses. And we have to demand electoral reform, and we have to elect more responsible governments than we've been electing to date. Thank you. I'll just make one additional comment, and I couldn't resist putting this in when I and Cindy Harlow and the crowd here worked with federal fisheries. We used to handle these pencils and pens out, no habitat, no fish. DFO no longer handles out these pens and pencils anymore.
Thanks very much, Otto.